Imagine standing at the edge of the world, where an ocean of grass stretches endlessly before you. The year is 1220, and on the horizon, a dark cloud rises. But it's not a storm. It's dust. And beneath that dust, warriors are riding toward you at a speed no army in history has ever matched. Tonight, we're chasing that dust cloud backward through time, to discover how it began. How a boy left for dead on the frozen steppe became the man who conquered more of the earth than Alexander, than Caesar, than Napoleon. How one lifetime, just one, redrew the map of the entire world. The Mongols exploded out of nowhere, or so it seemed to the civilizations they crushed. One moment, the great empires of China, Persia, and Russia stood secure behind their walls, confident in their superiority. The next, those walls were burning, and the world had changed forever. But here's what makes this story extraordinary: it almost didn't happen. The man who would become Genghis Khan was poisoned as a child, enslaved with a wooden collar around his neck, left to die in the wilderness more than once. He had every reason to fail. Every reason to disappear into history unnamed and forgotten. Instead, he united warring tribes that had spent centuries trying to destroy each other. He built an army that moved like wind and struck like lightning. He created the largest empire the world has ever seen, and he did it in just 21 years of conquest. From the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. From the Siberian forests to the Persian deserts. 1/5 of the world's population living under a single authority. Roads so safe that, as the saying went, a virgin carrying gold could walk from one end of the empire to the other without fear. How did it happen? How did nomads who didn't even have a written language until Genghis Khan conquered people who did? How did they defeat every sophisticated civilization they encountered? How did they learn siege warfare in months when it took other cultures centuries? How did they communicate across thousands of miles before radio, before telegraph, using only horses and fire signals? Tonight, we'll follow that extraordinary journey. Not with dry dates and battles, though there will be battles, breathtaking in their scale, but as a story. An adventure 8 centuries old that still shapes the world you woke up in this morning. We'll meet a boy clutching a blood clot in his newborn fist, an omen that terrified the shamans. We'll watch him survive his father's murder, his family's abandonment, and a childhood so brutal it would have destroyed anyone else. We'll see him transformed from a fugitive into a Khan, from a Khan into a legend. And we'll discover something unexpected, that these so-called barbarians brought not just destruction, but transformation. That they spread ideas, technologies, and tolerance across continents. That they accidentally created the connected world we now take for granted. This is the story of how thunder rolled from the steppe and changed everything. How the impossible became inevitable. How one man's hunger for revenge became history's greatest conquest. So settle into comfort. Let the tensions of your day dissolve. We're embarking on an adventure across 800 years, through lands you'll never see, to witness events that seem too vast to be true. But they are true. Every extraordinary moment of it. The Mongols are riding. Can you hear them yet? That distant rumble, growing louder. Let's ride with them. The Mongolian steppe in the year 1162 was a place of endless horizons. Imagine grass rolling like a green ocean, stretching so far that sky and earth seem to merge at the edges of the world. The air smells of horses and smoke, of earth and freedom. Into this world, a boy was born. His father, Yasugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigen clan, looked down at his newborn son and saw something unusual. The infant's right hand was clenched tight around a blood clot the size of a knuckle bone. The shamans murmured among themselves. This child, they said, would be a warrior. His hands would grasp the world. They named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain Yasugei had recently defeated. In Mongolian culture, taking the name of a vanquished enemy was a way of absorbing their strength. But young Temujin would need more than borrowed strength to survive what was coming. Life on the steppe was hard in ways we can barely imagine today. The Mongol tribes, the Tayikid, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, they were not one people, but dozens of clans locked in endless cycles of raid and revenge. Blood feuds lasted generations. A slight from 30 years ago could justify a massacre today. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father took him to find a bride among the Okanat tribe. There, they met a girl named Borte, wise beyond her 10 years. The match was made, and Yasugei left his son with Borte's family to begin learning the ways of his future in-laws, a common custom. On his journey home, Yasugei stopped to share a meal with some Tatars. They recognized him, remembered old grievances. They poisoned his food. When word reached Temujin that his father was dying, he raced home, but arrived too late. Yasugei was already buried in the earth that had given him life. And in that moment, 9-year-old Temujin's world collapsed. The Taikid clan, who had supported Yasugei's leadership, now abandoned his family. In steppe politics, a leader's death meant his followers were free to leave. And they did, taking the herds with them, leaving Temujin's mother, Holun, with 5 young children and nothing but the clothes they wore. What happened next would have broken most families. They lived on roots, on wild garlic, on marmots and field mice. Holun, according to The Secret History of the Mongols, the only native Mongolian account of Genghis Khan's life, written shortly after his death, became fierce in her determination to keep her children alive. She would hold up her quiver and tell them, "You are my arrows now." But survival came at a cost. Temujin and his half-brother better fought over food, over small game they'd caught. One day, after Better stole a fish and a bird from Temujin and his full brother Kasar, something snapped. Temujin and Kasar stalked Better through the grass and killed him with arrows, shooting him from both sides like hunting an animal. When Holun discovered what they'd done, her rage was terrible. "You are like wolves," she screamed at them. "Like savage dogs devouring their own flesh." This moment, this fratricide, haunted Temujin his entire life. He had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming a monster. The Taikid chieftains heard about the murder and grew worried. This boy Temujin was dangerous, they decided. Better to capture him now, while he was weak. They raided the family's camp and took Temujin prisoner, fitting him with a wooden collar called a kang, a heavy board that locked around the neck, making it impossible to feed oneself or lie down comfortably. They paraded him from camp to camp as a warning to others. But Temujin was patient. He watched. He waited. During a festival, when his captors were drunk on fermented mare's milk, berag, he struck his guard with his kang and fled into the forest. He hid in a river, submerged to his neck for hours, breathing quietly while search parties passed within feet of him. Finally, a man named Sorganshira found him. This man had no reason to help Temujin. Every reason, in fact, to turn him in. But he saw something in the boy's eyes, that fire the shamans had spoken of. Sorganshira hid Temujin in a cart of wool, then helped him escape. Years later, when Temujin had become Genghis Khan, he would find Sorganshira and reward him beyond measure. Khan never forgot kindness. But he also never forgot betrayal. By the time Temujin reached marriageable age and returned to claim Borte, he was no longer a boy. He was hardened, calculating, patient. Borte's father honored the arrangement made years before, and Borte came with a wedding gift that would change everything, a sable coat so luxurious it could buy an army. Temujin took this coat to Togrul, Khan of the Karaite tribe and his father's old ally. Togrul, impressed by the gift and by Temujin's bearing, agreed to support him. Slowly, carefully, Temujin began gathering followers. Not many at first, men without clans, younger sons, the dispossessed. But he treated them fairly, shared spoils equally, and rewarded merit over birth. Then came the raid. The Merkits, still nursing a grudge because Yasujii had once stolen a Merkit bride, Temujin's own mother, swept down and kidnapped Borte in revenge. For months, Temujin didn't know if she was alive or dead. The pain of this loss drove him to a fury he channeled into building alliances. With Togrul's help and that of his childhood friend Jamukha, Temujin assembled a force and attacked the Merkits in a dawn raid so swift and brutal that stories of it spread across the steppe. He recovered Borte, but she was pregnant. When she gave birth to a son, Joki, questions about the boy's paternity would shadow him his entire life. Temujin declared Joki his son and dared anyone to say otherwise. But the whispers never fully stopped. What's remarkable about these early years is not the violence. Violence was common on the steppe. What's remarkable is how Temujin learned from every betrayal, every loss, every moment of suffering. He was building something in his mind, a vision of how to prevent the cycles of chaos that had nearly killed him. A vision of unity. Of law. Of an empire. The relationship between Temujin and Jamukha is one of history's great tragic friendships. They were Anda, sworn brothers, having performed the ritual of blood bonding as boys. They had exchanged gifts, sworn to be as one person. For a time, their alliance made them nearly unstoppable. But the steppe had no room for two suns in the same sky. Jamukha was charismatic, from a powerful family, beloved by the traditional aristocracy. Temujin was different. He promoted men based on ability, not bloodline. He welcomed outsiders, even former enemies, if they swore loyalty. His growing band of followers looked less like a traditional clan and more like something new, a meritocracy held together by personal loyalty to Temujin rather than ancient tribal bonds. This was revolutionary. And deeply threatening. The break came gradually, then suddenly. According to The Secret History, Jamukha suggested they camp on different sides of a mountain, ostensibly to give the herds more grazing room, but really as a test. Temujin moved on, taking most of their joint followers with him. This quiet vote of loyalty from the people enraged Jamukha. In 1190, a year that would be forever marked in steppe memory, Jamukha assembled a coalition of 13 tribes to crush Temujin's upstart force. The Battle of 13 Sides was Temujin's first major defeat. Captured prisoners were boiled alive, a horrific practice even by steppe standards, designed to send a message. But Jamuka's cruelty backfired. Many who saw what he'd done to his prisoners thought it excessive, even shameful. More warriors drifted to Temujin, who was harsh but never needlessly cruel, who promised order in place of chaos. For years, they circled each other like wolves, sometimes clashing, sometimes avoiding confrontation, gathering strength. Temujin married his daughters and sisters strategically to build alliances. He promoted a brilliant commoner named Subutai, who would become one of history's greatest generals. He appointed Jebe, whose name meant arrow, after Jebe shot Temujin's horse out from under him in battle, then honestly confessed when captured. Temujin admired honesty so much he not only spared Jebe but made him a general. This quality, the ability to recognize talent even in enemies, was one of Temujin's superpowers. His army became a magnet for the ambitious, the capable, the loyal. And as it grew, so did its sophistication. Temujin organized his forces in a decimal system that would become legendary, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Each man knew his place in the formation. Each unit could operate independently but always as part of the whole. Communication ran through signal flags, burning torches, and thundering drums. But organization wasn't enough. The steppe tribe still resisted unification. The Tatars, who had poisoned his father, remained a threat. The Tayikid, who had enslaved him, still schemed. The Naimans and the Karite grew worried about Temujin's rising power. One by one, through battles and sieges and brutal winter campaigns that would have killed lesser armies, Temujin defeated them. But here's what made him different from previous conquerors. After defeating the Tatars, the people who had murdered his father, he didn't simply massacre them all, though tradition and revenge called for it. Instead, Temujin incorporated them. He took the Tatar survivors into his army, gave them the same rights and status as his original followers, and forbade anyone from even using the name Tatar as an insult. The dead were dead, he said, but the living could be useful. This pragmatism horrified the old aristocracy. But it worked. In 1204, Temujin faced his final challenge on the steppe, a coalition led by the Naiman Khan and supported, tragically, by Jamuka. The battle was fierce, but Temujin's disciplined forces, fighting with the desperation of men who had nothing to return to but victory, shattered the coalition. Jamuka fled and was eventually betrayed by his own followers, who brought him in chains to Temujin. The scene that followed is one of history's most poignant moments. Temujin offered Jamuka reconciliation, offered to restore their brotherhood. But Jamuka refused. He had been beaten by his Anda, and there was no coming back from that. He asked only for a death befitting a noble, to die without spilling his blood upon the ground. Temujin granted this mercy. Jamuka was wrapped in a carpet and his back was broken, so that his spirit could remain whole as it left his body. Temujin had him buried with honors on a hilltop overlooking the steppe they had once dreamed of ruling together. You can almost hear the wind sighing across that lonely grave. By 1206, at the age of 44 or 45, records from the era are imprecise, Temujin stood victorious. All the steppe tribes had been unified under his rule, something that had never been accomplished in recorded history. The shamans declared him Genghis Khan, a title whose exact meaning is still debated. Some say it means oceanic ruler, or universal ruler. Others suggest it comes from the Turkic word Tengiz, meaning fierce or strong. But the title mattered less than what came next. Genghis Khan created the Yasa, a legal code that would govern his empire. Loyalty to the Khan above all else. Religious tolerance, a stunning innovation in that age. Protection for merchants and messengers. Severe punishment for theft, murder, and adultery. For the first time, the Silk Road routes were safe. A virgin with a bag of gold could walk from one end of the empire to the other without fear, or so the saying went. Genghis Khan also did something else remarkable. He broke the power of the old aristocracy. The bone people, those who claimed privilege by birth, were subordinated to the free people who earned their place. In Genghis Khan's meritocracy, a shepherd could become a general. A slave could become an administrator. It was radical. It was effective. And it terrified the traditional kingdoms that surrounded the Mongolian steppe. Because Genghis Khan now had the most powerful army in Asia, unified under one command, disciplined, mobile, and hungry for what lay beyond the grasslands they'd finally conquered. The thunder on the steppe was about to become thunder across the world. To the south of Mongolia lay the Tangut Western Xia dynasty, and beyond it, the Jin dynasty of northern China. These were old, sophisticated civilizations with walled cities, standing armies, and all the cultural confidence that came from centuries of looking down on the barbarians of the north. They were about to learn a terrible lesson about underestimating barbarians. Genghis Khan didn't initially plan to conquer China. His first campaigns southward were about trade, about respect, about opening routes for Mongolian goods. But the Jin dynasty made a catastrophic mistake. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to negotiate, the Jin officials treated them with contempt. When he sent a larger delegation to establish trade relations, the Jin had its leader humiliated and sent back. In Mongolian culture, ambassadors were sacred. Their safety was guaranteed by the laws of hospitality that governed all steppe peoples. The Jin's treatment of Genghis Khan's envoys wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration that the Mongols were beneath the basic courtesies of civilization. Genghis Khan never forgot an insult. And he always repaid his debts. In 1209, he began his assault on the Tangut Western Xia. This was the Mongols' first encounter with siege warfare, with fortified cities whose walls rose higher than anything they'd seen on the steppe. The Mongols were cavalry warriors, masters of the open field but inexperienced with stone walls and defensive fortifications. So they learned. This is crucial to understanding Mongol success. They weren't just devastating warriors, they were devastating learners. When they encountered Chinese siege engineers among their prisoners, they integrated them into the army. When they captured cities with advanced metalworking, they took the craftsmen. When they found someone who understood Chinese bureaucracy, they employed them as administrators. The Mongol army became a cosmopolitan force, carrying Chinese siege engines, Persian scholars, Turkic auxiliaries, and Mongolian cavalry in one massive, adaptive war machine. The Western Xia fell by 1210. Then Genghis turned his full attention to the Jin dynasty. This was personal now. The Jin had killed his ancestors, had treated his people like animals for generations. The Jin dynasty ruled from Beijing, called Zhongdu then, protected by walls that stretched for miles, by hundreds of thousands of soldiers, by every advantage of civilization. It took years of brutal warfare, but the Mongols were patient. They studied gene defenses, adapted their tactics, and slowly tightened the noose. In 1215, Zhongdu fell to a combination of siege warfare, starvation, and the psychological terror that preceded every Mongol assault. The city burned for a month afterward, the smoke visible for miles. But Genghis Khan wasn't satisfied with destruction alone. He installed Khitan and Chinese administrators to run the occupied territories. He wanted taxes, not ruins. He wanted a functioning empire, not a desert. This pragmatism showed in another way too. When Mongolian generals wanted to turn North China's farmland into pastures for horses, Genghis Khan consulted with a brilliant Khitan administrator named Yelu Chukai. Yelu explained that taxing farmers would generate far more wealth than grass for horses. Genghis Khan listened. He overruled his generals. The farms remained. This willingness to take advice, to learn from the cultures he conquered, made Genghis Khan not just a destroyer but a builder. A synthesizer. He was creating something new, an empire that bridged nomadic and settled civilizations. But the learning went both ways. The Chinese, the Persians, the Europeans who encountered the Mongols would all absorb influences from these steppe warriors. Military tactics changed. Trade routes opened. Ideas about governance, about meritocracy, about religious tolerance, all spread with Mongol expansion. Meanwhile, to the west, a new conflict was brewing. The Khwarezmian Empire, stretching across Central Asia, was rich from Silk Road trade and powerful under its Shah, Muhammad II. Genghis Khan, busy with China, sent a trade caravan to Khwarezm in 1218 as a gesture of peace and commerce. The governor of the border city of Otrar accused the caravan of being spies and had all 450 members executed. Their goods were confiscated. When word reached Genghis Khan, he gave Shah Muhammad a chance. He sent 3 ambassadors demanding that the governor be punished and the goods returned. This was reasonable by any diplomatic standard. The Shah could have avoided catastrophe with a simple apology and restitution. Instead, Shah Muhammad had the lead ambassador killed and sent the other 2 back with their beards shaved, a profound insult in Central Asian culture. Genghis Khan is said to have climbed a mountain alone and spent 3 days in prayer, asking Tingri, the sky god, for guidance. When he returned, his decision was made. The Khwarezmian Empire would cease to exist. In 1219, he personally led an army westward. His sons commanded wings of this force, Joki to the north, Chagatai and Ogidai in the center, Talyui in the south. The Mongol invasion of Central Asia is considered by historians to be one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. City after city fell. Bokhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning, was captured in 1220. Genghis Khan rode into the city's great mosque, and while he allowed religious freedom, he had the mosques emptied and used as stables for his horses, a calculated act of symbolic humiliation for the Shah who had humiliated his ambassadors. Samarkand, another jewel of the Silk Road, fell after a 5-day siege. The populations of cities that resisted were often massacred to terrify others into surrender. But cities that submitted peacefully were generally spared, their people incorporated into the empire. This created a terrible calculus for city defenders: resist and face annihilation, or submit and perhaps survive. The Mongol reputation for ruthlessness was itself a weapon. Many cities opened their gates without a fight, terrified by stories of what had happened to those who resisted. Shah Muhammad fled, pursued relentlessly by Subbatai and Jebe, who chased him with 20,000 cavalry across Persia. The Shah died on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and alone. His son, Jalal ad-Din, proved a fierce warrior and won several battles against Mongol forces. But ultimately, he too was defeated, fleeing into India. The Khwarezmian Empire was destroyed so thoroughly that it ceased to exist as a political entity. But from its ruins, the Mongols gained administrators, craftsmen, engineers, and scholars who would help run their expanding dominion. By 1223, Subbatai and Jebe had swung north in one of history's most remarkable raids. They defeated the Georgians, the Alans, and at the Battle of the Kalka River, they crushed a coalition of Russian princes who had never encountered anything like Mongol tactics. The Russian forces outnumbered the Mongols 3-1, but Mongol mobility, their feigned retreats drawing enemies into ambushes, their coordinated archery from horseback, all proved devastating. The battle was a massacre. Russian princes were captured and executed by being placed under boards and slowly crushed as Mongol officers dined on top, a particularly cruel death reserved for nobility. But Subbatai and Jebe didn't stay. They'd accomplished their reconnaissance, learned about these western lands, and returned home across the Caucasus. They'd traveled over 8,000 miles in 3 years, defeated armies from a dozen different nations, and brought back intelligence that would shape future invasions. Genghis Khan now ruled from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. His empire was already the largest in history. And he wasn't done. By 1225, Genghis Khan was in his 60s, an old man by medieval standards. But age hadn't softened him. If anything, it had sharpened his determination to secure what he'd built. The Western Xia, which had submitted years before, had refused to send troops to help with the Khwarezmian campaign. This betrayal festered in Genghis Khan's mind. He had shown them mercy once. He would not again. In 1226, he launched what would be his final campaign. The assault on Western Xia was ruthless, systematic, and personal. City after city fell. The Tangut Emperor tried to negotiate, offered tribute, begged for mercy. Genghis Khan refused. He had been betrayed, and betrayal was the one sin he never forgave. But during this campaign, something happened. The exact details are murky, history blurs around the deaths of great men. Some sources say Genghis Khan fell from his horse during a hunt. Others suggest he contracted an illness, possibly typhoid or dysentery. Some Persian sources claim he was wounded in battle, perhaps by an arrow. Whatever the cause, by summer of 1227, it was clear the great Khan was dying. He summoned his sons, those who were close enough to reach him in time. Talyui, his youngest and favorite, was there. Ogidi, whom Genghis Khan had designated his successor despite not being the eldest. The conversations they had were said to be pragmatic to the end, strategic advice about future conquests, warnings about unity, plans for dividing the empire. Genghis Khan died in August 1227, in his field camp near the Western Xia capital. He was roughly 65 years old. He had lived to see his enemies destroyed, his people unified, and an empire stretching across Asia. But the manner of his death and burial remain one of history's great mysteries. According to The Secret History and other sources, Genghis Khan's funeral procession was accompanied by soldiers who killed every person they encountered, so that no one could reveal where the great Khan would be buried. Some accounts say 2,000 people were slaughtered along the funeral route. His burial site, somewhere in the Kentai Mountains of Mongolia, has never been found. 40 horses were said to have been sacrificed on his grave, and the soldiers who buried him were themselves reportedly killed to preserve the secret. Then the grave was trampled by horses until no trace remained, and trees were planted over it. For 8 centuries, archaeologists and treasure hunters have searched. Satellites have scanned the mountains. Ground-penetrating radar has swept likely areas. But the earth keeps its secret. Genghis Khan, who shook the world, rests in an unmarked grave known only to the grass and the wind. The western Xia capital fell shortly after his death, fulfilling his final command. According to legend, Genghis Khan had ordered that the entire Tangut royal family and its supporters be executed. This massacre was reportedly so complete that the Tangut people, as a distinct ethnic and political entity, ceased to exist. It's a chilling end to a chilling life. But as we let ourselves drift in this quiet hour, it's worth asking, what did Genghis Khan really accomplish? Was he simply a destroyer, as many historians portrayed him for centuries? Or was he something more complex? The answer, like the man himself, is complicated. The body count attributed to Mongol invasions ranges from millions to tens of millions, estimates vary wildly, but all agree it was catastrophic. Entire cities were erased. Irrigation systems in Central Asia were destroyed and took centuries to rebuild. The Persian scholar Javani, writing decades after the invasions, described the devastation as so complete that, where there had been cities, now there were only grass and weeds. But here's the paradox: the Mongol Empire also created the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, that made the Silk Road safer than it had ever been. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed between East and West on an unprecedented scale. Gunpowder technology, printing techniques, and astronomical knowledge spread. The Black Death likely reached Europe along Mongol trade routes, a devastating side effect of increased connectivity, but so did pasta, citrus fruits, and mathematical concepts from the Islamic world. Genghis Khan's policy of religious tolerance was revolutionary. In an age of crusades and religious wars, the Mongol Empire protected Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Taoists alike. Religious leaders were exempted from taxes. Debates between different faiths were encouraged. This pluralism was unprecedented in medieval empires. His meritocratic administration challenged aristocratic norms and inspired later innovations in governance. The Mongol census system, postal relay stations, and codified laws influenced everyone from Chinese dynasties to European kingdoms. Some scholars argue that Genghis Khan's unification of Eurasia was a crucial step toward globalization, that the modern world's interconnectedness has roots in the Mongol conquests. Others point to genetic studies showing that roughly 8% of men in the former Mongol Empire territories share a common ancestor from around the 13th century, possibly Genghis Khan himself, evidence of both his conquests and his lasting biological legacy. But these academic discussions can obscure the human reality: millions died. Families were destroyed. Cultures were erased. The trauma of Mongol invasions echoed for generations. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Genghis Khan was transformative, neither purely good nor purely evil, but a force of nature that reshaped the landscape of human civilization. Like a storm that both destroys and nourishes, his legacy is written in both blood and progress. As his body was carried to its secret grave, the empire he'd built was far from finished. His sons and grandsons would carry the conquest even further, into Europe and the Middle East, creating dynasties that would last centuries. But that story, that thunder yet to come, unfolds in the years after Genghis Khan's death. For now, let yourself rest in this moment between breaths, between eras, when one chapter closed and another began. After Genghis Khan's death, his empire split among his sons according to Mongol tradition, but remained united under a supreme Khan. Ogidi, the third son, took the throne as Great Khan. He was more diplomatic than his father, more interested in administration than conquest, though conquest continued nonetheless. The Mongols returned their attention to northern China and the Jin dynasty, which had been only partially subdued. By 1234, the Jin capital fell, and the dynasty that had oppressed Mongolia for generations ceased to exist. Chinese scholars, engineers, and administrators flooded into Mongol service, bringing sophisticated bureaucratic traditions that would transform how the empire was governed. But the most dramatic expansions came in the west, led by Bata Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson through Jochi. In 1236, Bata launched an invasion of Eastern Europe that would become legend, the beginning of what Europeans would call the Mongol horde. Imagine yourself as a Russian prince in 1237, ruling a prosperous city on the frozen plains. You've heard rumors of Eastern invaders, but they seem distant, unlikely. Then, in the dead of winter, when all sensible armies are in winter quarters, thunder sounds from the east. The Mongols are coming, and they're using the frozen rivers as highways. This was tactical brilliance that stunned European observers. Armies didn't campaign in winter. Rivers became obstacles. Snow made movement impossible. Except the Mongols, raised on the harsh steppes where winter lasted half the year, thrived in conditions that would kill southern armies. They struck Russia like a hammer. City after city fell. Ryazan was sacked in 1237 after 5 days of resistance, its population massacred. Vladimir fell in 1238, along with its grand prince and army. At the Battle of the Sit River, the Mongols annihilated the remaining Russian forces so completely that Russia effectively ceased to exist as an organized military power. Moscow, then a minor outpost, was burned. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, fell in 1240 after a brutal siege. The Mongols used captured Russian soldiers as human shields, forcing defenders to kill their own people. When the city finally fell, a Franciscan friar named Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, passing through 6 years later, described finding an innumerable multitude of dead men's skulls and bones lying upon the earth. The psychological impact was immense. Russian chronicles of the period speak of the Mongols as a biblical punishment, as Gog and Magog released upon the world for humanity's sins. They weren't seen as human armies but as apocalyptic forces. By 1241, Batu's forces reached the Carpathian Mountains and entered Poland and Hungary. European knights, the elite warriors who had conquered the Holy Land in crusades, prepared to meet these mysterious eastern invaders. At the Battle of Legnica in Poland, a combined force of Polish knights, German crusaders, and Templar orders faced the Mongols. The European forces were confident. They outnumbered the enemy. They had heavy armor and cavalry that had proven invincible in 100 battles. The battle was a catastrophe. The Mongols used their classic tactics, feigned retreats drawing the heavy European cavalry into extended pursuits, then wheel-answer-round maneuvers. Mongol composite bows could punch through European armor at distances where European weapons couldn't reach them. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. According to chronicles, the Mongols cut off the right ear of every dead European soldier and filled 9 large sacks with them to send back as proof of victory. The head of Duke Henry II of Silesia was mounted on a spear and paraded around the city walls before being sent to Batu as a trophy. 2 days later, at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, an even larger European force was destroyed. King Bela IV of Hungary commanded perhaps 50,000 men, one of the largest armies medieval Europe could field. The Mongols, numbering perhaps 25,000, orchestrated one of history's most perfectly executed tactical operations. Subutai, now an old man but still a strategic genius, commanded this battle. He divided his forces, using one contingent to fix the Hungarian army's attention while secretly sending another across the Sejo River to attack from behind. When the Hungarians realized they were surrounded, panic set in. The Mongols deliberately left a gap in their encirclement, a seemingly accidental escape route. The Hungarian army fled through this gap, into a killing field. The Mongols hunted them for miles, cutting down exhausted men by the thousands. Estimates suggest 40,000 Europeans died in this battle. King Bela barely escaped with his life. Europe was defenseless. The Mongols had destroyed every major army between them and the Atlantic Ocean. Vienna, Paris, London, all lay open. The Mongols had scouts reaching the outskirts of Vienna and probing into Austria. European nobles fled to fortified islands or hid in forests. Prayers filled cathedrals, begging God to spare Christendom from the Eastern apocalypse. Some historians suggest this trauma influenced Europe's later colonialism, a deep-seated fear of invasion that translated into aggressive expansion once Europe gained technological advantages. And then, inexplicably, the Mongols withdrew. In December 1241, Great Khan Ogidi died in Mongolia, possibly from drinking too much alcohol. According to Mongol tradition, all princes of the blood had to return to Mongolia to elect a new Khan. Batu pulled his armies back, abandoning his European conquests to participate in the succession. Europe was saved by bureaucracy, by tradition, by politics 8,000 miles away. Had Ogidi lived another year, European history would have been written in a very different language. The Mongols never returned in force to Europe. Batu established the Golden Horde, ruling Russia and the western steppes from his capital on the Volga River. Russia would remain under Mongol suzerainty, what Russians called the Tatar yoke, for nearly 2.5 centuries. This occupation profoundly shaped Russian culture, administration, and psychology in ways that historians are still unpacking today. Meanwhile, in the east, another grandson of Genghis Khan was pursuing his own devastating campaign. Monk Khan, who became Great Khan in 1251, turned his attention to the Song dynasty in southern China and to the Islamic heartlands of the Middle East. He sent his brother, Hulagu Khan, westward with perhaps 150,000 men, one of the largest armies the Mongols ever assembled. Hulagu's mission was to subdue the Abbasid Caliphate and the assassins, the notorious Nizari Ismaili sect that operated from mountain fortresses and killed political enemies through suicide attacks. The assassins had terrified the Middle East for over a century. Their strongholds, perched on seemingly impregnable mountain peaks, had withstood all previous attempts at conquest. But the Mongols were patient. They surrounded each fortress, cut off supplies, and waited. One by one, the fortresses fell. The last Grand Master of the assassins surrendered in 1256, and the sect was dismantled. Then Hulagu turned toward Baghdad. Baghdad in 1258 was perhaps the greatest city in the Islamic world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate for 5 centuries. It was a center of learning that had preserved and expanded Greek philosophy, pioneered algebra and astronomy, created poetry and art that influenced 3 continents. The House of Wisdom, its great library, contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, the accumulated knowledge of Islamic civilization. Caliph al-Mustasim refused to surrender, apparently believing his spiritual authority would protect him or that other Muslim rulers would come to his aid. Neither proved true. When Hulagu's forces surrounded the city in January 1258, no help arrived. The siege lasted less than 2 weeks. When the walls were breached, Mongol forces poured into Baghdad. What followed was one of history's darkest chapters. Estimates of the death toll range from 200,000 to over 1 million. The streets literally ran with blood, or so sources claim. The Tigris River supposedly turned black from the ink of books thrown from the House of Wisdom, and red from the blood of the scholars killed in the massacres. Hulagu had the caliph wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, the bloodless execution reserved for royalty. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had led the Islamic world for 5 centuries, ceased to exist. The psychological impact on the Muslim world was immense, comparable to the sacking of Rome by the Visigoths for Christians. It seemed that God had abandoned his faithful. But here's something remarkable: Hulagu's wife, Dokuz Khatun, was a Christian, specifically a Nestorian Christian, part of an Eastern Christian tradition that had flourished in Central Asia. She used her influence to protect Christians during the Baghdad sack. Churches were spared while mosques were destroyed. Christian populations in the Middle East briefly flourished under Mongol protection. This led to a strange moment in history where Crusader kingdoms briefly allied with the Mongols against their common Muslim enemies. Letters were exchanged between Hulagu and European monarchs discussing joint campaigns. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Mongol-Christian alliance might eliminate Islamic power in the Middle East entirely. It didn't happen. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in modern-day Israel, the Mongols suffered their first major defeat. The Egyptian Mamluks, slave soldiers who had overthrown their masters to create their own dynasty, met a Mongol force in pitched battle and won decisively. The Mongol general Kitbuka was captured and executed. The Mamluks had learned Mongol tactics, had studied their strategies, and had finally figured out how to defeat them, fight in terrain where cavalry advantages diminished, use intelligence networks to predict Mongol movements, and refuse to panic when facing their psychological warfare. This defeat established the southern limit of Mongol expansion. The Mamluks held Egypt, Syria, and Arabia. The Islamic heartland survived, though transformed by the trauma of Baghdad's fall. In China, Monk Khan died in 1259 during a campaign against the Song dynasty, either from dysentery, from arrows, or from cholera, depending on which source you believe. His death triggered another succession crisis, one that would eventually place his brother Kublai on the throne as Great Khan. Kublai Khan was different from his predecessors. He'd grown up among Chinese culture, spoke Chinese fluently, and admired Chinese civilization. When he became Great Khan, he moved the capital from Karakoram in Mongolia to Beijing, which he renamed Khanbalik, the city of the Khan. This decision was symbolic and divisive. Many traditional Mongols saw it as abandoning their heritage, of becoming too Chinese. But Kublai's Chinese orientation helped him accomplish what no previous Khan had managed, the complete conquest of China. The Song dynasty, ruling southern China from Hangzhou, was wealthy and sophisticated but militarily inferior. Between 1267 and 1279, Kublai slowly strangled it through a combination of massive armies, riverine naval forces, the Mongols learning yet another form of warfare, and economic blockades. The final battle came at Yamen in 1279. The last Song emperor, a 7-year-old boy, was aboard a ship when the battle turned against his forces. Rather than let him be captured, his minister picked the boy up and jumped into the sea, drowning them both. It was an ending of tragic poetry, the ancient dynasty choosing death over submission. China was unified under foreign rule for the first time. Kublai Khan declared himself emperor of the Yuan dynasty, blending Mongol and Chinese traditions into something unprecedented. He employed Persian administrators, kept Mongol military supremacy, practiced Tibetan Buddhism, and ruled according to Confucian principles. His court became one of history's most cosmopolitan places. It was to this court that a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo arrived in 1275, beginning a 17-year stay that would introduce Europe to the wonders of the East. Polo's accounts of paper money, coal for fuel, asbestos, and the sheer scale of Chinese cities seemed so fantastic that many Europeans thought he was lying. But he wasn't. He was describing a world that Mongol conquest had opened. By 1279, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Java. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history, encompassing roughly a quarter of the world's landmass and containing over 100 million people, a significant fraction of the global population. Four major khanates now existed: the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppes. They maintained nominal unity under the Great Khan but increasingly operated independently, each developing its own character shaped by the civilizations it ruled. The Pax Mongolica was at its height. Merchants traveled from one end of the empire to the other with relative safety. The Yam system, postal relay stations established by Genghis Khan, meant messages could travel across Asia faster than they would again until the telegraph. Cultural exchange flourished. Chinese silks reached Europe, Persian miniature painting influenced Chinese art, European craftsmen found work in Mongol courts. But empires, even the greatest, contain the seeds of their own dissolution. And the Mongol Empire, for all its power, was beginning to fracture. Let yourself drift now, as we move into the quieter years, the long aftermath, the slow transformation of conquest into memory. The Mongol Empire's decline wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, like sunset over the steppe, so slow you barely notice until suddenly it's dark. The Khanates drifted apart, pursuing their own interests. Civil wars over succession became more common. The very thing that had made the Mongols strong, their mobility, their steppe identity, became a liability as they settled into ruling vast, sedentary populations. In Persia, the Ilkhanate initially continued the devastation. But something remarkable happened in the 1290s. Genghis Khan converted to Islam, and with him, most of his Mongol nobility followed. The conquerors adopted the religion of the conquered. Persian culture, which had seemed on the verge of extinction, absorbed its invaders. Within 2 generations, Mongol rulers in Persia were writing Persian poetry, patronizing Islamic architecture, and preserving the very traditions their grandfathers had tried to destroy. The Ilkhanate collapsed in the 1330s, fragmenting into smaller dynasties. But it left a legacy, a renaissance of Persian art and science, a new synthesis of Mongol and Islamic traditions, and architectural wonders like the Dome of Sultania, built by Mongol Khans to rival anything in the Islamic world. In China, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty faced different challenges. The Mongols remained a minority ruling a massive Han Chinese population. They maintained this control through a complex system of ethnic hierarchies, Mongols at the top, then Central Asians and foreigners like Marco Polo, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. This system created resentment. So did economic problems, inflation from printing too much paper money, the costs of failed invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, typhoons destroyed both fleets in events the Japanese called kamikaze, divine wind, and expensive public works projects. By the 1350s, China was in chaos. Floods, famines, and rebellions swept across the land. The Red Turban Rebellion, led by Han Chinese patriots claiming to restore the Song dynasty, gained momentum. In 1368, a former Buddhist monk turned rebel leader named Zhu Yuanzhang captured Beijing and declared himself emperor of the Ming dynasty. The Mongols were driven back to Mongolia, their century of Chinese rule ended. But they didn't disappear. They remained a powerful force on the northern steppes, occasionally raiding China for another 3 centuries. The Ming built and expanded the Great Wall largely to defend against these Mongol raids. The wall as we know it today is mostly Ming construction, a monument to how much China still feared the steppe nomads. In Russia, the Golden Horde's domination lasted longer. Russian princes collected taxes for their Mongol overlords, traveled to the Khan's court for approval, and lived under the shadow of Mongol punitive raids. This period fundamentally shaped Russian political culture, centralized authority, the fusion of secular and religious power, the concept of the ruler as absolute sovereign. Historians debate how much of Russian autocracy derives from Mongol influence versus indigenous Slavic traditions. But there's no question that the Mongol period left deep scars and equally deep influences. Russian language borrowed hundreds of words from Mongolian and Turkic languages. Russian military tactics incorporated Mongol strategies. Even Russian taxation systems bore Mongol fingerprints. The Golden Horde finally fragmented in the 15th century, splitting into several khanates, Crimea, Kazan, Astrakhan. These successor states continued for centuries. The Crimean Khanate lasted until 1783, when Catherine the Great finally conquered it. Ivan the Terrible's capture of Kazan in 1552 is still celebrated in Russia as a defining moment of Russian expansion. So Mongol political entities persisted in some form for over 500 years after Genghis Khan's death, an extraordinary longevity for a nomadic empire. But perhaps the most unexpected Mongol revival came in the late 14th century from Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. He was a Turco-Mongol noble from Central Asia who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, though probably falsely, and built an empire that briefly rivaled the original. Timur's campaigns from 1370 to 1405 were consciously modeled on Genghis Khan's. He conquered Persia, sacked Delhi, defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, and was preparing to invade Ming China when he died in 1405. His capital, Samarkand, became one of the most magnificent cities in the world, filled with artisans and scholars dragged there from his conquests. Timur's savagery actually exceeded the original Mongols. He was infamous for building pyramids of skulls after capturing cities. Yet his dynasty, the Timurids, produced a remarkable cultural flowering. His great-great-great-grandson Babur would found the Mughal Empire in India, a dynasty that would rule until 1857 and create architectural marvels like the Taj Mahal. The Mughals, the name itself a Persian pronunciation of Mongol, saw themselves as heirs to Genghis Khan. So the Mongol legacy continued, transformed, mellowed, but recognizable, into the modern era. What then, is the final accounting of the Mongol impact? The death toll was catastrophic. Iran's population may have taken until the 19th century to recover to pre-Mongol levels. Baghdad never regained its medieval glory. Russia's development was arguably delayed by centuries of subordination. The trauma echoed through generations in songs, stories, and collective memory. But the Mongols also inadvertently accelerated historical processes. They destroyed old empires but created new opportunities. The devastation of Middle Eastern powers helped make possible the rise of the Ottoman Empire. The weakening of Central Asian trade routes prompted Europeans to seek ocean routes to Asia, leading to the Age of Exploration. Some historians even argue that the Protestant Reformation had distant roots in Mongol disruption of Catholic Church authority. The Mongols spread technologies. Gunpowder from China reached Europe through Mongol intermediaries. Printing techniques moved westward. Agricultural innovations spread eastward. The humble carrot, originally from Afghanistan, reached China via Mongol trade routes. Lemons spread to Europe. These small exchanges accumulated into significant cultural transfers. The Mongol postal system inspired later communication networks. Their military tactics influenced warfare for centuries. Even Napoleon studied Mongol cavalry strategies. Their administrative innovations, particularly census-taking and tax systems, were adopted by many successor states. Perhaps most significantly, the Mongol Empire demonstrated that the world could be connected, that goods and ideas could flow across vast distances, that different civilizations could coexist, however uncomfortably, under one administration. This was an early, brutal form of globalization that prefigured our modern interconnected world. In Mongolia itself, after the empire's collapse, the people returned to nomadic pastoralism. For centuries, they lived quietly, herding animals on the same steppes where Genghis Khan had united the tribes. They remembered their moment of glory through oral traditions, through the secret history, preserved in fragments, through a national identity centered on their greatest son. Genghis Khan's reputation has gone through remarkable transformations. Medieval sources, Persian, Chinese, European, universally portrayed him as a devastating scourge. The Russian Orthodox Church considered Mongol rule divine punishment for sins. Islamic historians wrote of him as humanity's greatest catastrophe. But in the 20th century, reassessment began. Scholars noted the Mongol promotion of trade, religious tolerance, and meritocracy. In post-Soviet Mongolia, Genghis Khan became the symbol of national revival, his face appearing on money, in statues, in proud declarations of Mongolian identity. Some modern historians have perhaps gone too far in rehabilitation, downplaying the genuine horrors of Mongol conquest in their eagerness to counter centuries of negative propaganda. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the complexity. Genghis Khan was a product of his time, an age when warfare was brutal, when life was cheap, when entire populations could be enslaved or massacred without international outcry. He was neither uniquely evil nor particularly merciful. He was ruthlessly pragmatic, brilliant in his strategic vision, and transformative in his impact. His empire rose from nothing and changed everything. From a boy clutching a blood clot, to a slave in a wooden collar, to the ruler of the largest land empire in history. From scattered tribes to an empire that bridged continents and cultures. The thunder from the steppe eventually faded. The armies returned home. The trade routes gradually shifted. The khanates fell. But the world the Mongols created, interconnected, aware of its own vastness, marked by their passage, that world never completely disappeared. Today, if you visit Mongolia, you can stand on the steppes where young Temujin survived on mice and roots. You can see the same endless grass, smell the same earth, feel the same wind that shaped him. The empire is gone, but the land remembers. In museums from Beijing to Paris, artifacts tell the story. Persian manuscripts illustrated under Mongol patronage, Chinese silk paintings from the Yuan court, Russian chronicles recording the Tatar yoke, European letters warning of the approaching apocalypse. And in the Kentiai Mountains, somewhere beneath the grass and the wildflowers, in a grave that has kept its secret for 8 centuries, lies the man who started it all. No marker. No monument. Just earth and silence. Genghis Khan, who once told his sons that, the greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, returned in the end to the earth that bore him. His empire fragmented, but its echoes never fully faded. We are all, in small ways, living in a world the Mongols helped create. The next time you use paper money, trace a trade route, or appreciate religious tolerance, you're touching something the Mongol Empire helped spread. The next time you see cultural exchange between East and West, you're watching a conversation that the Mongols, however violently, helped begin. History is not simple. It is not a story of heroes and villains, but of humans making choices in impossible circumstances, creating consequences that ripple across centuries. The Mongols remind us that transformation comes at cost, that creation and destruction are often inseparable, that the shape of our world was forged by forces we can barely imagine. As you drift now toward sleep, let these images fade, the endless steppe, the thunder of hooves, the smoke of distant cities, the clink of coins on the Silk Road, the whisper of prayers in a dozen languages, all under the vast eternal sky that Genghis Khan worshipped as Tingri. The story is over. The thunder has faded to echo, echo to silence, silence to sleep. The world continues turning, carrying within it the memory of when one man's ambition reshaped continents, when thunder rolled from the steppe and changed everything. Rest now. Let history become dreams. Let the past settle gently into the place where all completed stories go. The Mongol storm has passed. Morning will come. But tonight, you've traveled 800 years and 10,000 miles, and now it's time to rest. Sleep well.